Good morning. I'm Perry Bacon. I'm the host of the New Republics Right Now. I'm honored to be joined by one of the smartest people, I think, writing about politics, government, philosophy. Olúfẹ Táíwò is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown. He's written these brilliant books about reparations and also about a concept he refers to as elite capture. But I have in mind to talk about something much less intellectual, which is a lot of his posts on social media these days. He uses the phrase, I regret, I don't regret telling you that we're going to win. We are going to win. I'm not getting the words exactly right, but he's emphatically been over this last year as Trump has done radical thing after radical thing. You've been one of the voices saying that everything's not the things that are bad are happening, but also that some resistance is working. So, welcome, first of all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And so give me the exact phrase. What are you trying what phrase are you using most when I describe on social media?
Uh, I do not regret to inform you that we are going to win. That's what I've been saying over and over.
And why do you use that phrase?
Um, Honestly, the first time I used it was just kind of, you know, a sort of playful in the moment, poking fun at the blunders on the right, of which there are plenty.
Right.
And I think this is an important time to remember that that's the case. But people really seemed to respond to it. So I just kind of kept saying it. And more or less what I've had in mind is, I think we are appropriately responsive to the death and devastation. You know, I think sending people to torture centers, breaking up families, killing people in the streets, that is absolutely the right response on a human level. But a thing that's hard to keep in mind is that tactically, strategically, you know, the point of that hyper violence is to keep us there emotionally and to keep us from realizing how much power we have to resist them and how successful we can, and in the case of recent weeks, are being in resisting them. And so, that's the kind of thought behind why it's important to say stuff like that.
And in other words, so people don't get sort of too caught up in the sort of everything bad happening.
Yeah.
So talk about, like, the last few weeks. Like, what do you when you d what is are we at an inflection point? And I guess maybe since the election or really in Minneapolis, it does feel like something has changed, but how do you in terms of it feels like Trump is on defensive a little bit. It feels like we're not quite at 2020 levels, but it feels like people are outraged in a certain way. What are you seeing when you look at where we are right now?
Yeah. People are outraged. And I think, it's too early to tell for sure whether we're at an inflection point. Only historians have the benefit of being sure about those sorts of things. But it does seem like that. And it seems like that because we're seeing things on both the left and the right that, we saw maybe inklings of before, but I think we're seeing more dramatic versions of those updates. So on the right, there's been this kind of shamelessness. We're not going to fire people for having Nazi ties, kind of, you know, attempt to institute a culture of impunity. And it's never been um, total or absolute, right? They, for just to give one example, Paul Ingracia ended up uh, suspending his potential nomination to a federal position because of what was leaked in Republican group chats. So it's never actually they've never actually been able to project a total culture of impunity throughout the right.
Right.
But nevertheless, they called attention to Minnesota with this extreme mobilization of a disproportionate amount of federal agents, and for them to switch out leadership does, you know, not a minor position, a position they themselves called attention to, does show um, a level of vulnerability that they haven't shown before in such a grandiose, charged way. And, they can probably read the polls. There was a YouGov poll that came out that showed them uh, underwater with white people, with men, demographics that are typically strong for the right wing. So those updates probably correspond with whatever internal polling they're doing. Something is scaring them. And on the subject of something that's scaring them, here's this update on, let's call it the left, right? We are seeing an unprecedented amount of mobilization, not just from, you know, ragtag groups of activists, but being joined by people who didn't previously have organizing experience,
Right.
being joined by unions that were throwing their weight around. Minnesota had a general strike, in all but name, essentially, on one day. And the most recent murder of Alex Preddy is likely a response to the frustration that the federal agents felt from that incredible mobilization, right? So we're seeing levels of organized resistance that don't really have much of a parallel in recent history. The last general strike, announced as such was what, in the 40s, maybe in the 90s,
Right.
depending on what you count as the general strike, right? So we're seeing big changes.
And so you mentioned, I was going to ask, do you, why do you think polls matter? Because you're a philosopher. I assume you don't sit around and your actual work does not involve polls. I think there's a couple indications that that resistance is working, but I think the one that is sort of the most quote unquote objective is polls. What do the polls tell you?
I mean, I don't think they say much except, the short term horizon of political messaging, who's winning the messaging battle over
Right.
the last couple of weeks, right? But we have to understand, for political elites, um, people that run for office, or whose parties get reshaped every 2 years, they have more of a tangible reason to pay attention to polls than the rest of us do, right? Their political fortunes, their ability to throw their political weight around depend on these short term changes of opinion. So, while it's important not to get lost there, because things like institutional developments, like, say, the creation of a Department of Homeland Security, right, are not short-term problems. And we're right now seeing why we have to be willing to think in a more long-term manner than the next election. But it does tangibly seem to change the behavior of these people in office who are scrambling to get allies every couple of years in these elections.
And you said like the general strike, something has happened in Minneapolis that is unique, and I think that's a good sign. Like, what do you attribute that to? Like, just how heinous they've behaved, or Minneapolis is like a particular unique place, or what do you attribute that to?
Um, it's a combination of things, One, they're finding out the hard way, that you don't invade a strong winter people in the winter, just as
Right.
Napoleon and countless others found out, right? But, on something of a more serious note, there's been a large undercurrent of organizing since the murder of George Floyd,
Mhm.
right? Which was not far from where these recent murders happened. And those connections, I'm hearing, reactivated in the wake of this recent invasion by federal agents you know, their of a U.S. city. And all of that, combined with, yes, the heinous behavior of these federal agents, I think has had the effect of political education. It's the worst version of political education. It would
Right.
be much better to just explain history to people. But people living in Minnesota can just go outside and see that, in fact, what the left has been saying about DHS in particular, about ICE in particular, about border patrol, what all these, you know, seemingly radical activists have been saying that might have sounded alarmist 6 months ago is just a plain anodyne description of empirical reality that you can see in front of you. And that has, I think, demonstrably radicalized a lot of people in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, and people outside of that state in that city who are, reasonably plugged in to credible information about what's happening over there.
When you say we, how do you think about that term in this context? Like, and I assume you don't necessarily mean Democrats, but I'm just curious what you mean by that.
Yeah, honestly, at this point, I mean anti-fascists, right?
Yeah.
I think we are entering a stage of politics where, I mean, for whatever misgivings people have, something like a quote unquote popular front is needed, where people who identify as Democrats, people, like myself, who would consider themselves to be to the left of that, all need to find common cause. And even, people on the right who have, principles, uh, as many of them as there are, need to find common cause in fighting this particular fight against authoritarianism and seem to be doing so.
We are going to win is just different than we are winning. So why we are going to win?
Yeah, I think that phrasing is important because, one of the things that I alluded to when I first explained why I use that phrase is, what I'm not trying to do is, look at these heinous murders, look at the campaign of mass deportation, look at this campaign of ethnic cleansing, and say nothing bad is happening or this is what victory looks like. That is absolutely not the impression that I'm trying to give. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Right? Why I'm saying this is because things look so dire, and the ability of federal forces to concentrate on slivers of the country and generate these spectacles of hyperviolence is part and parcel of their political strategy to make it look like they have power that they don't, in fact, have. This is an massive country. They're facing massive resistance, even in the small cities, or even the large cities that they target. That resistance is effective, by the way, and they can't deploy this strategy everywhere, right? So they depend on generating these spectacles, generating this social media environment of fear and capitulation as a force multiplier. If we just, harass and attack this many children, we can convince people that our victory is inevitable. And it is important now more than ever to remind people that that's not, in fact, true. And the brave people risking their lives on the streets of Minnesota are, in fact, doing something that is effective, are, in fact, doing something that we can and must learn from, and are, in fact, doing something that can work at scale. And the more we pay attention to how they're resisting, rather than just the evil they're resisting, the likelier we are to realize that we can win, we must win, and we will.
So let me frame it differently because I've been thinking about this myself a little bit. Is like I try to make sure some of my coverage is about victories over Trump instead of all Trump did something evil. I think, and that's what you're doing too. Is like it's important to highlight the wins, both because that's a reality, but also to keep people aware of that victory is possible.
Absolutely.
Um,
Um, One thing I might just bring up in this kind of valence, there was a really good interview that Eric Blanc at laborpolitics.com did with a Minneapolis organizer who works with Twin Cities Sunrise Movement. And it's just detailing how effectively they've been able to target specific businesses and target uh, ICE through targeting those businesses, doing things like holding up the counters at Target and campaigns targeting the hotels that they were staying at to complicate the logistics. And some of these events ended up in the national news. Not all the news coverage highlighted the role of activism in getting hotels to say they're going to stop hosting ICE agents. But the results of what they did ended up in the national news because the results of what they did were demonstrably effective, right? And so paying attention to interviews like that, learning the tactics that they used, understanding that we're not helpless. There's a lot of us, and a lot of us are, in fact, doing things that are effective in protecting their neighbors. I think that's important for all of us to pay attention to.
Is there a way you see this as a philosopher the rest of us don't see resistance that is maybe worth thinking about? How do you see this because of the way you think, the way you studied? Is there anything about this that the philosophers see that the journalists don't see that I should think about?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'll tell you. I'll tell you how I think of it as a philosopher, and you can tell me if
Yeah.
it matches how your view is. But really, for me as a political philosopher, you know, some philosophers have science envy. They try to be like scientists. Um, as a political philosopher, I feel like the kind of envy that I do have and should have is historian envy, right?
Okay.
I want to think about politics like historians think about it. These long term, pitched, protracted struggles that pop up in waves and recede in waves, but that nevertheless push in certain directions, right? And it's hard in the mud and muck of day to day life to tell these long term, decades long, centuries long stories of political struggle. It's hard to realize that that's what you're in fact doing when what you see is what's happening day to day. And so, if there's any marked difference between how a philosopher or a political philosopher might think about these things and a journalist, it might just be that, right? Just because the nature of our jobs, right? One of us has to pay attention to the short term
Right.
to do their job effectively. I have to pay attention to the long term to do my job effectively. By talking to each other, we can, both learn something, right?
But you're watching the
But
short term
my
stuff right
view,
now, right?
yeah, yeah, I am, exactly. But exactly that, I'm watching the short term and watching journalists explain the short term to me so that I can
Okay.
figure out what's going on, right? But the way that I'm thinking about this from that perspective is the right in this country has been losing for decades. Right? That's what the civil rights movement was. It was a world historical defeat of the politics of segregationism and apartheid that this administration and its allies palpably want to bring back,
Right.
right? And this hysterical, you know, comic book villainy is their attempt to spectacle and meme and earned media their way out of the reality that no one likes what they stand for.
Right.
And that is a victory that has been won culturally through literally generations long struggles. Even before the abolitionism of the 19th century, people were fighting this fight over what the terms of basic moral decency were going to be. And those terms eventually came to exclude uh, the outward misogyny and the um, valorization of ethnic cleansing and segregationism that this administration represents. And everything that they're doing is an attempt to reverse those losses by way of terrorism, essentially. And, if there's a place that my confidence comes from, it's by looking at the long arc of history and seeing how decisively it's swung against them and just thinking that, you know, we are capable of winning the battles that were won in the 60s. We are capable of winning the battles that were won in the 50s and 70s. You know, we're not any less capable of doing that than the people who preceded us were.
It's interesting you said that because I think a lot of let me not ask a dumb say it in a dumb way, but I think a lot of people you can read history, particularly the history of Black Americans in the U.S., and you can read that in two ways. One, that there's been a lot of resistance that has succeeded. The other that a lot of the structure of the country has not changed in a lot of ways. The inequality has remained. The civil rights movement did not actually have a lot of did not produce the economic gains it hoped to. So you're reading it. There's a couple different ways to read this, and I think these stories are connected. But you're reading it maybe the history says we can resist, but also you acknowledge history also says we may not overcome, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And just both of those things are true, right? We didn't achieve the world we deserve, right? Um, but they used to buy and sell people on the street
Right.
in many of the places that we're protesting, right? And we don't have to pretend that for whatever, for whatever distance there is between the egalitarian utopia and where we are now, we don't have to pretend that things are the same, right? There were battles that were won. The limitations and constraints on those victories represent the continued investment of the structures of this country and all the others in, you know, various forms of inequality, various forms of injustice. Um, both of those things are true. But what this administration and the current authoritarian opposition represents is an attempt to bring back a form of inequality, a specific set of forms of injustice that were decisively defeated, and can be defeated again.
Let me go through a sort of a not a rapid fire, but I want to finish with a couple things that are a little bit away from what we are talking about. The first is, I guess, Zoran, you said the Democrats and people to the left of the Democrats. So you said yourself as a group, put yourself in the group of people left of the Democrats. Let me ask this. So on the one hand, Zoran Mandami wins this great election. It seems to be reforming New York in a more left progressive way. On the other hand, today I read about the Center for American Progress, maybe the leading think tank among Democrats, is calling for more policing and an embrace of more tough on crime policies. And so my question might be, I agree with more Zoran and less with the Center for American Progress, but I guess my question is, are these conflicts related at all? The sort of fight with the right and the fight between the left and the center left?
I think so. I think the one, the most charitable way to put it, I suppose, would be to think of it as a kind of ideological fight or a tactical fight over how it is that we're going to resist authoritarianism. And the center left believes that the kind of policing that has evolved in this country is at least in principle professionalizable, um, in principle, an engine of the democratic will. And what we're seeing in ICE with the Border Patrol, with this attempted federalization of policing that the president is pushing, is something other than what's developed in local police departments, right? So it's an attempt to wall off the protests of 2026 from the protests of 2020, right? That's the charitable view. It's not my view. I happen to think, as a matter of fact, that ideologically, uh, an embrace of policing and a kind of authoritarian politics behind that is just an element of convergence between the center left and the far right. They just both believe in the project of handing people guns and handing money to the people with guns, whatever fraction of social resources, public resources that they demand this year, and being willfully ignorant of the abuses of those people, whether it's Cop City in Atlanta or the feds in Minneapolis. And I think what we have to gear up for is a struggle with those people, right? It's not different in principle from political struggle writ large. It's, there's the compromise position that makes sense. One side is going to have to lose and the other side is going to have to win. And, the best version, let's say, in a liberal democracy would be an electoral process. Um, there are more activist-y versions where people have to do direct actions of some sort. And then there's open conflict. And you hope that it will take one of the first two forms, but those questions aren't for us to say.
Let me end with talk about Hammer and Hope. You're involved in this journalism project. Let's talk about that a little bit if you can. Hammer and Hope is a website. It's been about 3 years old now. Very important one, I think. So talk about what you guys are doing there.
Yeah, thanks. So at Hammer and Hope, it's a Black Left magazine that really tries to be both to varying extents a center for real open thinking and conversation around core ideas, what kinds of appeals to people make sense, what are the obstacles in Black politics and left politics writ large, what's the best way to understand them, but also reporting as well. What happened with the federal agents who attacked a Chicago apartment building, right? What's going on in Cancer Alley, right? What's going on, for that matter, in Minneapolis right now, especially with Black union members, right? So really trying to
Great piece on
be
how
a center
Zoran
for,
won the. There was a great piece about Zoran and the black working class, which I hadn't really read anywhere else. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, absolutely, right? So trying to be a place where, especially, people on adjacent to the Black left can kind of have conversations and find information that maybe you wouldn't find elsewhere.
For our audience, tell people what the black left means. What you mean when you say that?
Yeah, that's
You
that's
mean not Barack Obama,
always
but
a
sort of
contentious one.
go through it a little bit if you want to, just to help me understand. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's so you have Black people involved in the labor movement. You have Black nationalists. You have Black people who are members of, I guess, what you could call traditional left formations, Democrats, socialists, anarchists, etc. All of those people for very different reasons, maybe might have a range of political perspectives, a range of things that they think are central political questions that maybe other people in those kinds of organizations or different kinds of organizations wouldn't think of as central political questions. And, we at Hammer and Hope just wanted to facilitate a space where conversations can happen within and across those different groups of people.
Okay. I mean, thanks for joining me. This was a great conversation. Good to see you. And thanks for giving us all a little bit of hope this last year. It's been helpful to how you flagged things I hadn't seen, and I do feel like you're helping me see that we maybe can get past this moment we're in now.
I'm glad to hear that.
All right, take care.
Thanks for having me.
Bye bye.
Take care.